If you have a creative person in your life, or are a creative person in your life, or spend any amount of time on the internet watching the artists and writers toil away in the posting mines to someday fulfill the dream of affording hamburger, you are definitely more than familiar with the epic highs and lows of the artistic process. Creativity is one of life's great can't-do-it-on commands, and creative inspiration frequently strikes like a bolt out of heaven and far more frequently does not do that. I've seen the creative process described as being possessed by an idea you are constantly arguing with, and boy if that don't sum it up nicely. An artist can hone their craft over years and years of practice and refinement and grueling, rigorous training, but on some level they'll always be at the mercy of inspiration, and that is the one part of the creative process that no artist has figured out how to control. In my personal experience, nobody feels or acts more like the plaything of a cold, uncaring god than an artist wrestling art block. It's an unpredictable roller coaster that drags the hapless bard from the epic highs of I am a shining golden god and the master of making sense to the dismal lows of I will surely never have another good idea in my life, and then right back again 3 days later. So it's not too surprising that in many mythological models of the universe, this unpredictable and fickle ingredient in the lives of so many is the domain of an unpredictable and fickle deity, or in some cases, several deities. So today let's talk about the ancient Greek gods of inspiration, the 9 Muses. Now, not to name names, but some mythologies have a habit of playing pretty fast and loose with their use of simple numbers. When they say something like, there's this many of this thing, sometimes they're lying. But thankfully, when it comes to the Greek Muses, this is not the case. Kind of. More on that later. Basically, every piece of ancient Greek literature agrees that there are 9 muses, and as far back as Hesiod's Theogony, which is one of the earliest ancient Greek sources we have access to, we get a solid list of them, names and all, and there are, in fact, exactly 9. Not only that, but Hesiod doesn't just slap him into the family tree. As a card-carrying bard type, Hesiod talks about the muses a lot, from a pretty personal standpoint. The entire framing sequence of the Theogony is that Hesiod was minding his own business, shepherding sheep on the slopes of Mount Helicon, when the muses rocked up and divinely ordained him to lay out the whole cosmological family tree in vivid and comprehensive detail. Not too surprisingly, ancient Greek poets evidently had a lot of reverence for the muses, and while the muses don't really feature as characters very often, they get woven into narrative framings quite a lot, with the Iliad famously starting with a prayer to the muses asking them to play that one about Achilles making his bad day everyone else's problem. When it comes to the casting of these myths, the muses aren't usually the talent, they're the directors behind the camera. There are a couple minor exceptions, one of which comes up very early in the timeline in Homer's Iliad, where the muses get to star in a classic tale of hubris gone wrong. Thamris the Thracian is a talented musician favored by the muses, but one day he brags that he could outperform the muses themselves in a contest of the arts, and in response they smite him divinely and take away his performing ability and also his eyes, in case he didn't get the message the first time. Anyway, Hesiod's Theogony doesn't just invoke the muses, it also lists them in a nice numbered fashion, which is such a rare treat for me that we're just gonna go down the list. I don't get to indulge this very often, alright? Let me have this one. Hesiod lays out that the muses are the daughters of Zeus and the Titaness Mnemosyne, the goddess of memory, and he starts off his list with the boss of the muses, Calliope, which means beautiful-voiced. She's generally seen as the inspirer of epic poetry and has the distinction of being basically the only muse with a consistent mythological presence. She's always listed as the mother of Orpheus, and while she doesn't really show up in his story, it's thematically pretty clear that she's why his music is so overwhelmingly magical. Hesiod distinguishes Calliope from her sisters in one more key way. Calliope is the muse delegated to inspire kings. If Zeus approves of a king and thinks he'll make a good leader, the muses grant him the power of rhetoric and make him real good at public speaking and stuff. This feels like a bit of a correlation-causation fallacy, but I love the vibes on this one. When it comes to the many sides of showbiz, politics somehow manages to be even more unforgivingly carnivorous than Hollywood. Now after this, Hesiod basically just lists the muses by name, and the names all have pretty blatant literal translations, but the idea that they're each in charge of specific domains of individual slices of creativity are kind of a later development. It's clear from their naming conventions that they were already thematically subdividing the creative inspirational process, but the ancient Greek writers that talked about them mostly just referred to them as a unit. So while we do have a nice numbered list, and I'm gonna say what every muse is classically considered to be in charge of, because otherwise what is the point of doing it as a numbered list, it's important to note that this sort of hard world building around them seems to have been a retroactive thing. Anyway, next up, Clio's name means to recount or to celebrate, and appropriately enough, she's generally framed as the muse of history, and she also gets a minor credit in a myth. Way down in the 2nd century CE, Pseudo-Apollodorus' Bibliotheca says that Clio made fun of Aphrodite for her love affair with Adonis, and Aphrodite love-beamed her in revenge to make her fall for this king Pyrrhus. Things happen, and the end result is Clio and Pyrrhus' son, Hyacinthus, who would go on to date Apollo and then die about it. Talk about not learning from history. Next on the list is Euterpe, whose name just means delight, which is pretty unspecific, but she mostly gets featured in a musical context and is sometimes credited as the inventor of the double flute. In the Bibliotheca again, she's also listed as the mother of King Rhesus, whose primary claim to fame is getting his horses stolen by Odysseus and Diomedes in the Metal Gear chapter of the Iliad. Next on the list is Thalia, whose name means the joyous or the flourishing, and she is unsurprisingly the muse of comedy, while her sister Melpomene is the muse of tragedy. The Bibliotheca gives more details and says that Thalia, by way of Apollo, is the mother of the Corybantes, which were a Phrygian cult of Cybele worshippers, while Melpomene is credited as the mother of the Sirens. Of course, not every ancient Greek source agrees with the Bibliotheca, so the parentage gets a little fluid. Terpsichore, whose name means delight in dancing, is the muse of dance in the chorus, exactly what it says on the box. Terpsichore is also a very good example of that flexible parentage thing, since she also gets credited as the mother of Rhesus and the Sirens by a few different authors. We're starting to see the effects of the muses basically always functioning as a matched set. It's easy to start mixing them up. Erato, whose name is a spoiler, is the muse of erotic poetry, and apparently also mimicry. I don't see the connection, please do not explain it to me. And as a pretty handy illustration of that thing I said about the muses not having concrete themes, she's the muse Virgil specifically invokes when he kicks off the second half of the Aeneid, which, to be frank, isn't the steamiest bit of poetry around. So that tells us even by Virgil's Roman times, the muses hadn't been pigeonholed. Polyhymnia, whose name means many praises, is the muse of hymns and sacred poetry. And finally, rounding out the cast, we have Urania, the muse of astronomy. She's usually portrayed holding a globe and sometimes gets her role expanded to be the full-on goddess of the heavens themselves. Gotta be honest, I personally wouldn't classify astronomy as an art form. Maybe I should. Maybe the world would be a better, more whimsical place if I did. And that's the list of 9 muses. Man, that was quick. I don't know how the clickbait channels do it. That was definitely not enough time for a mid-roll ad. But there's really not much else to say about them like that. The muses just don't really show up in many myths. They have a name that usually literally means what they represent, they have a favorite accessory they're usually visually portrayed with, and that's kind of it. If we wanted to flesh them out further, we would need to start writing fanfiction. There's just not many stories there. And that might be because the set of myths we have access to are a pretty small slice of the full corpus of ancient Greek literature that used to exist, since there's a heavy element of randomness in what curds of history make it through the cheesecloth of time into the present day. But the muses were so widespread and so universally worshipped, at least according to all the storytellers, who I cannot imagine being biased in this regard, that I think it's legitimately noteworthy that they very rarely take any sort of starring role. And that kind of brings up an interesting thing about the muses specifically. When it comes to the Greek gods, sometimes it feels like the myths we have about them make it easy to forget that they're gods. They played a complicated role in society beyond just having fun stories about them. And I'm not saying this is a bad thing. I love those fun stories. Unpacking them or goofing on them is a lot of good fun times for me. But this is an angle of approach that works when we have those stories to work on. We can focus on the hijinks and shenanigans and the Zeus putting his wiener where it doesn't belong, and not really think about what depth these stories might have had for people steeped in a cultural context that we're 2,500 years late to understand. The myths kind of provide this buffer around that idea. It gives us something to focus on and be goofy about. The muses don't really have those fun stories. Instead, they have poets talking about them like the way modern artists talk about creative inspiration. It's a much more present, personal kind of thing, and the conversation about them is often very candid about the fact that the muses aren't characters in a story with a canon, they're components of a living religion, which is basically the same thing as saying they're parts in a constantly developing working model of the universe. And this conversation really starts to get interesting after the Romans show up. Around 45 BCE, Cicero wrote a philosophical dialogue called On the Nature of the Gods, where, in classic philosophical dialogue fashion, Cicero gave several characters philosophical stances and had them argue with each other for 3 whole books. One of the characters is an academic skeptic whose position is basically, the gods are ridiculous stories that don't make sense if you think about them, and when he's listing his evidence, he mentions some interesting things about the muses. The first relevant claim he makes is that some people say there were 3 Jupiters, who we remember the Romans used as a syncretized synonym for Zeus. So he says the first Jupiter was born in Arcadia as the offspring of Ether, aka Chaos, and was the father of Bacchus and Proserpine, aka Dionysus and Persephone. Jupiter number 2 was also born in Arcadia, but this one was the kid of Calus, aka Uranus, and the father of Minerva, aka Athena. Ugh, dealing with the Romans always gives me a headache. Anyway, the dialogue continues that Jupiter number 3 is the son of Saturn, aka Cronus, born on the Isle of Crete. Then, having laid out his multi-Jupiter hypothesis, he gets to the muses, starting off with the claim that the second Jupiter had the first group of muses as his daughters. First group? What do you mean first group? Yup, he says there were originally 4 muses, and gives them the names, oh boy, Thalciope, Aeide, Arche and Meleti. And then he says after that, Jupiter number 3 got with Mnemosyne and produced the 9 muses we already know about. This is a baffling conversational flashbang to drop, and he's not even done, because for good measure he says some poets claim there's another set of 9 muses, with the same names as the second set, obviously, otherwise it would get confusing, who he lists as the daughters of Pyrrhus and Antiope. And I know what you're thinking, but no, this is apparently not the same Pyrrhus that Clio had that fling with. Second, unrelated Pyrrhus. And if you just can't get enough of the guy, don't worry, there's more where that came from. Now, this is very convoluted, probably intentionally. Cicero wrote this barely 2 years before he got assassinated, and doesn't seem to have done any copy editing before he bit the big one, and as a kicker, when he interjects a little author's note at the end of the spiel, the dude firing off these hot takes is not the dude he says he personally agrees with. But this is already a really interesting framing. Even from the potentially cartoonishly exaggerated perspective of the enlightened skeptic, the fact that the number and grouping of the muses was the subject of active debate is neat. It was pretty clear that the Romans were aware that the ancient muse worshippers had not always worshipped the same set of muses that they were familiar with. A very similar framing turns up in Plutarch's Questiones Convivales, written somewhere in the 1st century CE. This is also framed as a philosophical argument between a diverse set of characters, but it's additionally framed as a big question and answer challenge, where the characters pose brain teasers to one another and try to unravel them to everyone's satisfaction. The muses get referenced off and on, getting petitioned to make their performances good, and broadly functioning as one expects deities of creativity in the arts to work. But question 14 is specifically about the muses and kicks off a really interesting conversation. Basically, all the participants in the dialogue start arguing with each other over which of them gets which muses. The rhetorician makes the claim that while certain haters will tell you that Calliope only keeps the company of kings, real ones know that rhetoric is a very Renaissance skill that every muse wants a piece of. A discussion breaks out over why there are specifically 9 muses and why 9 is such a nice number in general. One of them pipes up that it's common knowledge that in ancient times there were only 3 muses, but, and this is not a joke, citing his sources on that would bring down the party vibes, so he won't. Honestly, fucking power move. I wish they could put that on Wikipedia. Citing my sources would make me a narc. Anyway, this idea comes up in the conversation that initially there were only 3 major fields of study that the muses were in charge of, but as the arts and sciences advanced and were subdivided, the domains of those original 3 muses were also split into 3s, and the speaker proposes that an initial trifecta of philosophy, rhetoric, and math was subdivided into 3 smaller trifectas. Philosophy gets split into logic, ethics, and physics, rhetoric gets demonstrative, deliberative, and judicial subtypes, and math gets split into the 3 genders of music, arithmetic, and geometry. Ta-da! Everything important is broken into 9 clean parts and everybody gets a muse, except for the large crowd of poets and doctors and astronomers who immediately kick up an enormous fuss about having their designated muses confiscated by this asshole of a paradigm. And of course the one farmer in the bunch tries to explain how he should still get Thalia because when you think about it, crops growing is a little bit like comedy. The conversation goes in more weird directions. Other possible muse classifications are proposed, including one that puts the 3 muses in charge of the entire universe in a series of basically concentric spheres, with one called Hypati in charge of the fixed stars, one called Mezi in charge of the planets, and one called Niti in charge of everything under the moon. After a few more fascinating hypothetical cosmological models, the narrator eventually puts forth his own opinion on the muses. Letting all the heavenly stuff be the domain of Urania, he basically proposes the idea that the other 8 muses don't belong to specific professions, but instead have a role in absolutely everybody's lives, providing rules and regulations and a guiding system to help Joe every Roman live a healthy and well-balanced life. It's not like only comedians ever experience the joy that Thalia is in charge of, and it's not like only kings need to use those good leadership qualities that Calliope doles out. The narrator of this dialogue basically suggests that the muses exist to regulate and essentially civilize those natural universal parts of life. Oddly, the breakdown of the muses' role in this model doesn't super line up with their traditional artistic inspiration domains unless you really squint, and this is pretty late in the timeline for the muses to not have their quote-unquote classical roles locked in, but the concept is there. According to this slice of the dialogue, Calliope helps with logical reasoning, Clio inspires nobility and lofty aspirations, Polyhymnia guides people to seek out and retain knowledge, Euterpe inspires curiosity and speculation into the workings of the natural world, Thalia regulates physical hunger and transforms it from a simple animalistic desire for food into a regulated, civilized social ritual, Erato tempers wild lust into the concept of orderly marriage, and Terpsichore and Melpomene work together to temper the excess out of exceptionally beautiful sights and sounds, so so they're only very pleasant and not enchantingly overwhelming. In this model, the Muses are present in literally every aspect of life, not just for the poets or the astronomers. It's a very elegant model, and Urania is the only muse left unaccounted for in the daily life of Joe Every Roman because she's much too busy handling all of space. And the vibes of this dialogue carry pretty smoothly into the 2nd century CE, where Pausanias' descriptions of Greece also brings up the sheer scope of the worship of the Muses, going so far as to say that basically every temple he's visited in his travels has had the Muses represented in them, usually backing up a major deity like Apollo. He also references the apparent common knowledge that before the 9 Muses, there used to be a set of 3 Muses worshipped in certain regions, listing them with some of the same names Cicero did, along with an explanation of their meanings. Meleti, meaning practice, Nemi, meaning memory, and Idi, meaning song. He credits some random Macedonian named Pyrrhus, that's right, it's this fucking guy again, with popularizing the 9 Muses model, and goes so far as to say that some people speculate Pyrrhus himself had 9 daughters with the names commonly ascribed to the 9 Muses. This is basically what Cicero had his enlightened skeptics saying on the nature of the gods, so that lines up pretty well. There used to be 3, or maybe 4, now there's 9, and some dude named Pyrrhus and his 9 daughters were involved at some point. And following this thread, Pyrrhus and his daughters turn up in another one of our old standbys, Ovid's Metamorphoses from right around the aughts CE. In a framing device of a conversation between Athena and the muse Urania, she recounts a story where the king Pyrrhus had 9 daughters, who, in another classic display of mortal hubris, falsely compared themselves to the Muses and challenged them to a contest of performance. One of the girls told the story of Typhon in a goofy and ridiculous manner that made the gods sound like fools. I wouldn't know anything about what that's like. While on the Muses' side, Calliope recounted the tale of Demeter's search for Persephone after her abduction to the underworld, and the compromise that led to the division of the seasons. The nymphs judging the contest found Calliope's performance much more compelling and awarded the victory to the Muses, which did not sit well with Pyrrhus' daughters, and instead of gracefully taking the L, they kicked up a big fuss about it, to which the Muses responded by turning them into magpies. And honestly, this is almost a relief. This is such a classic formula for Greek god misadventures. Someone slights the gods turn them into something nasty. I went so far into the research process before I found a story the Muses actually participated in. I was almost worried we had another Hestia on our hands. In the space of Greek mythology, some of the gods seem so universally revered on such a personal level that they don't get stories told about them. They're more like natural laws than characters. Researching this made me start pondering a question I've never given much thought to before. Why do these myths exist? Why are these stories told about some gods and not others? Why were these primordial forces of nature embodied as the stars of their own little goofy sitcoms where the god of the horrors of war gets stuffed in a jar for a year, or the guide of dead souls steals a herd of cattle by putting their hooves on backwards? And there are a lot of explanations that get proposed. Oh, the myths exist to explain things in the natural world, like why that mountain is there, or why the stars are that shape. They get told as allegories to explain the social and political order, like why that city is where it is and why the king's godly heritage means he deserves to be in charge. This simple explanation really likes proposing the idea that stories get told because the world must be explained. And tempting as they are, I've learned to be very suspicious of a simple explanation. I don't think there's any one reason stories get told, and I think the sheer universality of the Muses is proof of that. The one consistent through line through the texts we've unpacked here is that the Muses are confounding. What is their role? What's their place in the natural order? Do they guide the hearts and reason of humanity, or do they turn the heavens themselves? How many of them are there? What's the point of them? Who gets them and why? Even by Roman times, the Muses aren't locked into their classical domains. That farmer in the Questiones Convivalis says Thalia should be the muse of farmers, and that doesn't make any sense from a muse of comedy standpoint, but it does make sense if we go back to the literal meaning of her name. Flourishing. Only Urania's role as the muse of astronomy is even halfway consistent, and even then, is she the god of those who study the stars, or is she the god that moves the stars themselves? The Orphic Hymn to the Muses, written sometime between the 3rd century BCE and the 2nd century CE, so a pretty wide spread on that one, described the Muses not as gods of the arts, but as gods of knowledge and truth. Their domain is framed as teaching humanity divine knowledge, inspiring with truth and guiding away from error. If the Muses are gods of storytelling, then this angle suggests that the purpose of storytelling is to reveal truth. Storytelling is how we make sense of both the world around us and the world inside us and turn it into something we can share. It's a foundational pillar of communication, of society and history. It introduces causality and pattern recognition into what was originally just a big pile of things that happened. Of course, gods of artistic inspiration and creation feel universal, filling every aspect of life from the literal heavens down to the farmer's fields. They haven't yet invented a thing that can't be thought about, can't be talked about, can't have art made out of it. What's the difference between being a god of telling stories and being a god that moves the heavens themselves. Both of those things still need to be turned into stories before we can understand them. The arts become the largest, most universal domain by default. Every myth we have belongs to the Muses. No wonder they feel more godly than the rest. They can't be contained by their own framing device. Inspiration isn't just about making creative brain go burr. Its oldest meaning is divine guidance, being breathed into a mortal from an unseen and unknowable source. We've circled back to the foundational truth that inspiration can't be fully understood or controlled. Why are these stories told about the gods? Why do we tell the stories we tell? Why do the ideas that we get come into our heads the way that they do? I don't know. Maybe the Muses will tell me if I ask real nice.
Music grows in the rose, rock and the rain and the blowing snowstorm. Everything seems to sing everywhere I go. I say 1, 2, play me do. Let me sound as sweet as you.